A low cloud of dust followed the transport truck as it rolled toward the gates of the U.S. POW camp, its engine coughing like it, too, was tired of the war. The guards waiting on the gravel path tightened their grips on their rifles, not out of fear, but routine discipline, while the December wind rattled their jackets. When the truck finally lurched to a stop, the gates swung open, and a group of high-ranking Wehrmacht officers stepped down with the stiff dignity of men who refused to believe they had been defeated. Their boots hit the dirt as if striking foreign soil were beneath them. One officer, a silver-haired general whose uniform remained immaculate despite days of travel, scanned the camp with a faint smirk. So, he murmured to another, "These are the boys America sends to guard us." The others allowed themselves a quick, amused breath. It wasn't loud, but it carried. Several young American guards, most barely in their 20s, heard it, exchanged glances, and said nothing. The silence wasn't weakness, it was patience. The officers walked in a tight cluster, their chins high, their eyes filled with the same assumption many German leaders had held for years, that the United States was a land of factories but not fighters, abundance but not toughness. Official German propaganda had repeated it endlessly. Americans were soft, sheltered, guided by comfort instead of discipline. They believed the nation's youth grew up on movie theaters, automobiles, and chewing gum, not adversity. To the generals, defeat by such soldiers felt mathematically impossible. So in reality, contradicted ideology, the easiest refuge was arrogance. The camp they entered, however, was unlike the brutal compounds they imagined. Rows of clean wooden barracks stood in orderly lines. Smoke curled steadily from a kitchen chimney. The American flag hung still in the winter air. This was no chaotic battlefield prison. It was a structured environment run with a confidence that didn't require theatrics. Yet the generals interpreted the calm as naivete. They saw the tidy grounds and thought it meant the Americans lacked the steel to handle prisoners of their stature. A young sergeant approached, posture straight, clipboard steady. He looked no older than 23, his face still carrying traces of boyishness that hadn't yet been carved into adulthood by war. "Welcome to Camp Shelby Temporary Holding Unit," he said, voice even. "We'll begin processing momentarily." His politeness, to the generals, registered not as discipline, but proof of their earlier assumptions. One of them leaned toward another and whispered in German, "Children playing soldier." Had he known the sergeant grew up on an Illinois farm, rising at 4 every morning since he was 10, he might have chosen another metaphor entirely. As the group moved toward registration, the tension between perception and reality grew sharper. The Americans took fingerprints, logged names, inspected documents. Everything was methodical. The generals complied outwardly, but carried themselves like men enduring mild inconvenience rather than incarceration. Their pride hadn't yet reached the stage of reflection. During medical inspection, one colonel raised his brow at the sight of another guard, a 19-year-old with sleeves rolled to his elbows, taking inventory of supplies with practiced efficiency. The boy's arms were corded with the kind of muscle that comes not from training halls, but from daily survival. Yet the colonel dismissed him with a glance. "These youths," he muttered, "have never known hardship." The irony hung in the air like a quiet contradiction waiting for its moment. Documents from the period record comments like these with surprising consistency. German officers, especially those from elite formations, struggled to reconcile their worldview with the physical reality of American manpower. They came from a culture that romanticized toughness as something born from suffering. Drill fields, strict hierarchies, hunger, and uniformity. America's path was different. A nation with vast farmland, mechanical innovation, and physical labor woven into the rhythm of ordinary life. In the Midwest, a 15-year-old might spend more hours lifting sacks of feed than a conscript in training. But the generals did not yet know this. In their minds, toughness came only from the militarized state, not from daily existence. The camp commander, a middle-aged major, approached as the final signatures were taken. His tone was firm, respectful, and devoid of theatrics. "Gentlemen," he said, "you'll be assigned to housing shortly. Tomorrow, you'll join one of our labor detachments supporting agricultural operations in the county." The announcement drew a visible reaction. A few generals stiffened. One laughed outright. "Agricultural work?" he repeated. "Your boys think they can teach us farming?" His tone hovered between disbelief and insult. He had no idea that the nearest fields were worked by some of the strongest young men in the region, boys whose hands told their own histories. The Americans, to their credit, simply noted the comment and proceeded with the briefing. Labor detachments were standard across the country, designed to fill gaps left by millions of American men deployed overseas. By late 1944, over 200,000 German POWs were working on U.S. farms, railroads, and factories. They contributed millions of labor hours without which American food production would have struggled. But the generals, insulated by hierarchy and ego, believed this assignment beneath them and doubted the competence of those who would oversee it. To them, the idea that America's youth could manage anything of consequence leaned toward comedy. Later, as the Germans were escorted to their barracks, the camp lights flickered on against the early evening sky. The wind carried the scent of diesel and distant hay. One general, adjusting his overcoat, glanced toward a group of off-duty American soldiers tossing a football across the yard. They moved with casual athleticism, laughing in the cold. The general scoffed. "Look at them," he said. "Playful, unserious. This is your mighty America." The comment was meant to sting, but the guard walking beside him simply smiled. "You'll meet some of our boys tomorrow," he replied. "They're a little different from what you expect." The general dismissed the remark, assuming it was bravado. Yet something in the guard's calm certainty, quiet, almost amused, lingered in his mind. It was the first time the officer noticed an American looking at him, not with intimidation, but with the patient confidence of a man holding an unspoken advantage. Inside the barracks, as the generals unpacked their few belongings and the lights dimmed, the earlier smirks finally faded into thoughtful silence. They believed they understood the nation that held them. They believed they understood its youth. But the fields beyond the camp, and the boys who worked them, carried a truth none of the officers had anticipated. And by sunrise, that truth would break through their assumptions with a force no battlefield had ever delivered. Dawn crept over the Midwestern horizon with the slow, deliberate confidence of a place that had never rushed to impress anyone. A thin veil of fog clung to the ground, muting the colors of the land into shades of pale gold and quiet gray. The German generals, escorted by a pair of young American guards, stepped out of the transport truck and into the cool morning air. The field stretched endlessly before them, broad, unbroken, and humming with a silence that felt older than any empire they had served. One general inhaled deeply, expecting softness, expecting stillness, expecting nothing that could challenge the hardened identity he had carried through years of war. But the land spoke first, not with words, but with motion. Across the field, figures emerged through the mist. American farm boys, their silhouettes sharpened by the rising sun. They moved with an ease that gave the landscape a kind of rhythm, lifting, hauling, adjusting machinery with the practice calm of people who had done these tasks since childhood. There was nothing theatrical about them. No polished uniforms. No medals. Just rolled sleeves, weathered gloves, and a sturdiness that came not from drills, but from decades of inherited labor. The generals exchanged glances, each trying to interpret what they were seeing. These are not the soft youths they had mocked. They looked more like living extensions of the land itself. The first task was simple, or so the Germans believed. A wagon filled with feed sacks waited near the barn, its wooden frame creaking under the weight. The sacks weighed over 80 pounds each, dense with grain grown for the war effort. A young American, no older than 18, walked up to the wagon and swung one sack over his shoulder in a single, unstrained motion. Then another, and another. He wasn't showing off. He was simply working. Two boys beside him did the same, chatting casually between lifts, their laughter rising above the quiet thrum of the morning. The generals froze. Their expressions, once painted with confident dismissal, shifted by a fraction. They weren't ready to let go of their assumptions. Not yet, but a crack had formed. When the Germans were asked to assist, pride moved them forward before practicality could intervene. One colonel crouched beside a sack, gripped it tightly, and attempted to hoist it. His face reddened, not from exertion alone, but from the realization that the task was not as simple as it appeared. Another officer joined him, and together they managed to lift one sack, wobbling dangerously as the Americans instinctively stepped aside to avoid being caught beneath the load. The colonel set it down abruptly, breathing hard, and wiped his brow. The American teens didn't laugh. They simply nodded in quiet acknowledgement, their politeness forming a sharper contrast than mockery ever could. A tractor sputtered to life nearby, its engine shaking the ground with a familiar rumble. One farm boy, his hands stained with grease, tightened a bolt and climbed into the seat. The machine obeyed him like a well-trained horse, rolling forward with perfect coordination. German officers watched intently. To them, machinery was a symbol of industrial strength, discipline, and wartime necessity. Yet here, a boy barely out of high school controlled it with instinctual mastery. Another teen knelt beside a mechanical hitch, adjusting it with the confidence of someone who had rebuilt engines long before he learned algebra. There was no hesitation, no wasted movement. The Germans found themselves staring, unable to disguise their surprise. The American guards, observing from a distance, exchanged a knowing glance. For them, this scene was ordinary. They had grown up with these boys, competed with them in schoolyard games, watched them build barns, fix roofs, and repair engines using nothing more than a hammer, rope, and stubborn determination. To the guards, these were just hometown kids. To the generals, they were a contradiction so stark it bordered on disbelief. As the morning work continued, the contrast grew sharper. When a wagon was caught in a rut, 3 American boys lifted the corner to free it, muscles tightening beneath sweat-damp shirts. A German officer approached to assist, only to realize his presence was unnecessary. When a tractor belt snapped, one teenager patched it with a strip of canvas and a wire twist, as if performing a trick he had done 1,000 times. The generals had spent their careers commanding battalions, managing logistics with mathematical precision. Yet here was a boy, barely 19, solving mechanical problems faster than a professional engineer. A young American paused beside one of the generals and offered him a sip of water from a metal jug. "Warm morning," he said. The general accepted the jug reluctantly, swallowing a mixture of water and pride. He noticed the boy's hands, rough, calloused, unmistakably shaped by labor that no military academy could replicate. He realized for the first time that these boys did not train to be strong. They were strong because they had grown up in a world where strength was simply part of living. By mid-morning, the fog had lifted fully, revealing the vastness of the land. The generals stood in the open field, no longer speaking with the same dismissive certainty. The labor they had belittled was not mere physical toil. It was a disciplined choreography of agriculture, machinery, and endurance, a battlefield of its own kind. The boys moved with a quiet unity, each task flowing into the next with the rhythm of necessity. They didn't need rank. They didn't need titles. Their authority came from competence. One general, the same man who had mocked the guards the day before, found himself watching a young American repair a broken axle. The boy wiped sweat from his brow, tightened a bolt, and stepped back as the equipment hummed to life again. He grinned, not in arrogance, but satisfaction. Something inside the general shifted. It wasn't humiliation. It wasn't defeat. It was recognition. This was the strength he had failed to see, hidden not behind banners or parades, but in the quiet, relentless work of everyday life. As the Americans prepared for the next task, the generals stood in a loose semicircle, no longer whispering among themselves. They were finally beginning to understand the truth forming before their eyes. The United States had not built its wartime power on softness or inexperience. It had built it on generations of young men who grew up lifting, building, repairing, and solving problems without anyone applauding them for it. And as the farm boys gathered near the barn, ready for the next assignment, one of them glanced toward the officers with a faint, knowing smile. "Ready for round 2?" he asked lightly. The generals did not answer. They were too busy reconsidering everything they believed they knew, just as the real revelation of the day was about to unfold. The turning point arrived with no trumpet, no command, no dramatic clash, just a quiet mechanical failure that split the morning calm. A wooden axle under one of the wagons cracked with a sharp, splintering pop, sending the load slumping to one side. The German generals, who had been observing the farm boys with guarded fascination, instinctively stepped back as dust puffed around the fallen wheel. For a moment, everything stilled. Then one of the American teens, a 17-year-old with freckles across his cheeks and sleeves rolled high on his arms, strode toward the broken wagon with the unhurried confidence of someone who had fixed things far more complicated before breakfast. He knelt beside the axle, brushed away the loose dirt, and examined the brake as if reading a language only he understood. The generals watched in silence. Their world had been built on hierarchy. Men waited for orders from above, repairs required specialists, and every task followed a chain of authority. But this boy didn't wait for instructions. He called out for a hammer and a length of wire with the tone of someone who expected the world to respond. And it did. Another boy tossed him the tools. A third arrived with a spare wooden block. Together, without any discussion, they began adjusting the wagon, working with the natural synchronization of people who had grown up solving problems side by side. The generals, so used to the rigidity of military procedure, felt a strange tension rise in their chests. Part envy, part disbelief. One officer approached, curiosity overriding pride. "You will replace the axle entirely?" he asked in accented English. The teenager didn't look up. "No need," he replied. "Just needs bracing. Won't be pretty, but it'll run." The general blinked. Bracing a snapped axle was the kind of improvisation military mechanics avoided unless desperate. Yet this boy treated it like routine maintenance. When the teen finally hammered the last piece into place, he stepped back, wiped the grease on his shirt, and motioned for the Germans to lift the corner again. The wagon rose smoothly. The wheel held. The machine was alive again. It was in that moment, quiet, ordinary, undeniably human, that the silence fell. The generals, with all their decades of doctrine, found themselves confronted not by military might, but by the raw, adaptable intelligence of a youth they had dismissed as weak. They watched the boy walk away, already moving on to another task. He didn't revel in their astonishment. He didn't notice it at all, and that, somehow, made the impact even deeper. The midday sun grew warmer, softening the morning's crisp air. As work resumed, the Germans began seeing the farm boys not as isolated curiosities, but as the living explanation for something they hadn't understood for years: America's endurance. Each task stripped away another layer of their assumptions. When the boys hoisted fence posts into place, their bodies moved with practiced efficiency. When they slung ropes around bales of hay and hauled them across uneven ground, their strength seemed effortless, almost casual. When one teen climbed atop the barn rafters to tighten a loose board, the height didn't faze him. He moved with the balance of someone who had spent a lifetime working above the ground. A general known for his uncompromising discipline studied these movements with growing discomfort. In Europe, toughness had been forged by scarcity and struggle. Here, toughness sprouted from abundance, not of wealth, but of responsibility. These were teenagers raised in large families, where every set of hands mattered. They had known droughts, storms, broken machinery, and long winters. They had grown into their strength through daily necessity, not military indoctrination. And unlike soldiers shaped by war, their resilience carried no bitterness. It was simply part of who they were. As the afternoon progressed, the Germans began attempting tasks alongside the Americans, driven partly by pride and partly by an unfamiliar desire to understand. One officer took a saw and tried cutting through a thick branch. His strokes were uneven, his pace unsteady. A boy no older than 16 approached, offered a gentle correction, and demonstrated the rhythm needed. Not force, but flow. The officer nodded, surprised at the boy's respectfulness. It wasn't superiority. It wasn't mockery. It was guidance. And it came without hesitation from someone too young to shave regularly. Bit by bit, the gap between the two groups narrowed. Not physically, but philosophically. The Germans found themselves listening, observing, recalibrating. Their earlier arrogance felt increasingly hollow. These boys had survived not by commanding others, but by learning early that survival depended on collaboration, mechanical literacy, and quick thinking. In a way, the Americans resembled a different kind of soldier, one shaped not by state ideology, but by the land itself. Late in the day, a sudden gust of wind swept across the field, carrying the scent of hay and warm soil. The generals, now tired from unexpected exertion, stood beside the barn as the boys prepared for another round of loading. A hush settled briefly, a pause in the rhythm of labor. In that stillness, the Germans realized something they hadn't dared consider before. This was America's real secret. Not the factories, not the weapons, not the endless supply lines. It was the people, the youth. The sheer physical and mental durability that came from a life rooted in practical problem solving. And if these boys represented this soft generation, what did that say about the nation behind them? As one of the generals leaned against the fence, catching his breath, he glanced again at the teen who had repaired the axle. The boy was laughing now, tossing a clump of dirt at a friend. The sunlight caught the dust around him, turning it into a halo of muted gold. Something in the general's chest tightened. Not regret, but respect forming where contempt had lived. It was new, unfamiliar, and quietly humbling. The farm boy noticed the general looking, offered a simple nod, and returned to work. The gesture was small, but carried weight. In that nod was an acknowledgement, not of rank or defeat, but of shared humanity. And for reasons the general couldn't name, it unsettled him more than any battlefield loss. As the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the field, the Americans prepared the final load of the day. The generals, now silent, watched intently. They had seen strength. They had seen skill. But they sensed there was something more, something still hidden beneath the surface of these boys' quiet competence. And as the wagon rolled forward, its repaired axle holding firm, the general felt a question echo uncomfortably in his mind. What other truths about America had they been wrong about? The harbor was quiet beneath a pale morning sky as the repatriation ship prepared to depart, its hull groaning softly against the wooden pier. German officers, now months removed from the arrogance that had accompanied their arrival in America, stood along the railings with expressions far more complicated than pride or defeat. Among them was the silver-haired general who once mocked the youth of the United States with near-musical confidence. Now he watched an American dock worker, barely 20, swing crates aboard with the same easy strength he had seen on the farms. The boy hummed as he worked, unconcerned with the audience of decorated officers. The general's fingers tightened around the railing, absorbing the truth he had resisted for too long. The foundation of American power was not machinery, not strategy, not luck. It was people like that boy, raised by land and labor rather than ideology. The officers had spent the months leading up to this departure in a strange limbo, no longer combatants, not yet civilians, living in barracks that became, in their own quiet way, classrooms. Each day on the farms peeled back another assumption they had carried into captivity. They had seen teenagers wielding tools with an instinct that rivaled military engineers, witnessed boys who could repair engines quicker than trained mechanics, and observed a workforce capable of feeding a nation at war without collapsing under the weight of responsibility. It wasn't just strength that impressed them. It was an unspoken discipline woven into ordinary life. They had misread it as softness because it wasn't loud. Now, as the ship's horn bellowed across the water, memories of those months replayed in the general's mind with cinematic clarity. He recalled the morning a storm tore through the fields, ripping shingles from barns and scattering tools across the muddy ground, it unraveling of beliefs that had felt immovable for decades. The guards, too, had changed in the general's eyes. Their youth no longer symbolized softness. It symbolized potential. They carried responsibility without ornament, authority without posturing. The general had once dismissed them as children playing soldier. Now he understood that they were young men expected to become everything at once. Workers, protectors, mechanics, neighbors. Their strength was multidimensional because their lives demanded it. As the ship's crew pulled up the gangway, the general reached into his coat pocket and withdrew a folded sheet of paper. It was a letter he had written but never sent, addressed to his son back in Germany. In it, he described the unexpected respect he had developed for the Americans, a respect born not from defeat, but from understanding. He wrote about the farm boys and their resilience, about the guards who carried themselves with steady confidence, about the ordinary people who had revealed extraordinary truths. Strength, he had written, is not born in barracks. It grows in the quiet places, fields, workshops, family tables, where responsibility becomes instinct and humility becomes wisdom. He wondered what his son would think of such an admission. Would it be seen as betrayal or enlightenment? The war had ended, but the world he would return to was fractured, uncertain, hungry for direction. Germany would need rebuilding, not just its cities, but its sense of identity. He hoped, quietly, that the lesson he had learned. The farm boys had arrived before sunrise, faces determined, clothes already soaked, moving through the chaos with calm precision. They cleared fallen branches, secured livestock, repaired broken beams, all before breakfast. The generals had watched from under the shelter of the barn roof, ashamed of how their boots remained dry, while the boys worked knee-deep in mud without complaint. A colonel had whispered, "If these are their children, what strength do their soldiers possess?" Silence answered him. Back at camp, evening discussions among the officers shifted from ridicule to reluctant analysis. They debated whether German youth could have matched such mechanical confidence, whether years of militaristic rigidity had cost them the adaptability that came naturally to the Americans. One officer noted that in Germany, boys were shaped into soldiers through drills. In America, boys were shaped into problem solvers through living. The distinction, once subtle, now felt enormous. The general had listened to these conversations with growing unease, realizing that the United States' greatest advantage was not industrial capacity. It was a cultural resilience born far from the battlefield. On their final day of labor duty, the farm families invited the POW detachment to share a simple outdoor meal. Long tables were set beneath an oak tree, covered in dishes that tasted of comfort rather than victory. The Germans ate quietly, humbled by the generosity of people who owed them nothing. A young boy offered a plate of cornbread to the general, who hesitated before accepting it. The child's smile held in America might offer a blueprint, a society built not on fear or rigidity, but on capabilities shaped through everyday living. A gust of wind swept across the deck, snapping the ship's flag sharply. The general folded the letter again, tucking it close to his chest. Around him, officers murmured among themselves, voices subdued. It wasn't shame that silenced them. It was clarity. Each man carried home a truth he hadn't expected to find, that the strength of a nation rests not in its proclamations, but in the character of its people. And America's people, young as they were, possessed a quiet power Germany had failed to recognize until the war was already lost. As the ship pulled away from the pier, the general cast one last look at the harbor. The farm boy who had inspired so much of his reflection was still there, wiping sweat from his brow, already moving on to the next task. No acknowledgement, no farewell, just the steady rhythm of a life that had always been enough. The general felt the weight of that image settle deep in his memory. It was not a symbol of defeat, but of revelation. And as the shoreline drifted further away, a single thought pressed forward with unexpected force. If the future belonged to people like that boy, then the world, broken though it was, might still have a chance to rebuild itself with better hands than the ones that had shaped its destruction.